A judge who was supposed to embody justice used his power to unjustly punish a black woman, driven by blatant racial prejudice. Little did he know that woman was a federal prosecutor, someone who would not remain silent in the face of such injustice. The story unveils the bias and prejudice ingrained in the judicial system, leaving us all with a powerful and valuable lesson. Where are you tuning in from? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you won't miss more meaningful stories like this. The clock on the car dashboard read 8:42 a.m. as Kendra Johnson swiftly pulled her car into the cramped parking lot outside the Greenville City Courthouse in South Carolina. The faint morning sunlight spilled onto the pavement, offering no warmth to the tension brewing within her. She took a deep breath, adjusted the rearview mirror, and looked at her reflection in the flawlessly tailored dark suit. Professionalism exuded confidence, but only she knew how tumultuous her morning had been. An urgent human trafficking case had disrupted her schedule. As a federal prosecutor, Kendra was no stranger to high-pressure situations. But dealing with an unexpected matter right before leaving the office had turned her morning into a race against time. She had meticulously prepared to defend her grandmother's house, a place filled with childhood memories and emotional value far beyond its monetary worth. Yet now, every passing moment seemed to conspire against her. Stepping out of her car, her briefcase felt heavy, not just with legal documents, but with the weight of expectations. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, snapping her out of her thoughts. It was a message from her assistant. "Be careful, Kendra. Judge Marcus Whitman is strict about tardiness. Don't give him any excuse to make things harder for you." Kendra pressed her lips into a thin line. The warning didn't intimidate her, but it served as a reminder. This wasn't a place for mistakes. The courthouse loomed ahead, a small, old building standing stoically in the heart of the city. Unlike the grand federal courts she was accustomed to, this one had an air of modesty, its faded walls and dust-speckled windows speaking of neglect. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of old paper and cheap coffee. A quiet line of people waited, clutching thick folders, their faces etched with anxiety. Civil disputes, parking tickets, minor grievances. This was the kind of courtroom where life's little complications felt monumental. Kendra walked through the corridor, her eyes skimming over the mismatched signs and half-open doors. Everything here, from the dim lighting to the whispered conversations of those awaiting their turn, felt foreign. She checked her watch. 8:50 a.m. 10 minutes to spare, but the urgency in her steps made her heels echo louder, as if the building itself was reminding her of the stakes. The door to courtroom 204 came into view, marked with a brass nameplate that read Judge Marcus Whitman. The plate caught the weak glow of a wall sconce, its gleam oddly ominous. Kendra inhaled deeply, adjusted her collar, and pushed open the heavy wooden door. All eyes in the room seemed to land on her at once, not quite scrutinizing, but enough to make her feel an unusual level of attention. The courtroom's interior was a stark contrast to the polished federal spaces she was used to. Scratched wooden benches, scattered papers on desks, and an air of suffocating tension. It was a space that made the stakes feel personal rather than procedural. A fleeting sense of unease washed over her, but she dismissed it. She had a job to do, and no matter how unfamiliar the surroundings, she wasn't about to falter. Kendra sat in the back row, trying to maintain her composure as the stifling air of the courtroom enveloped her. The rustling of papers, the screeching of chairs being adjusted, and the low murmur of voices gradually faded to silence when Judge Marcus Whitman entered. A tall man with neatly combed silver hair and piercing blue eyes, He moved with the deliberate precision of someone who knew how to command authority. "Sit down." His voice rang out, sharp and cutting, immediately silencing the murmurs. No one dared to breathe loudly. Even Kendra, who was well accustomed to high-profile federal courtrooms, could feel the unique weight in the air. It wasn't the solemnity of justice. It was domination, an imposition. One by one, cases were called. A middle-aged man in a rumpled suit arrived late, bowing his head quietly as he took a seat. Kendra noticed that Judge Whitman didn't look up or display any visible displeasure. Moments later, a young woman in a simple t-shirt and jeans slipped into the seat right in front of him, also without rebuke. But when Kendra's name was called, the atmosphere shifted. Walking to the stand with a briefcase in hand, she felt the judge's cold gaze pierce through her like a sharpened blade. "Your Honor, I am Kendra Johnson, federal prosecutor," she began, keeping her voice steady despite the pounding of her heart. But before she could explain her case, his sharp voice cut through her words. "This court's time is not to be wasted," he said, each word dripping with contempt. "You were late. Do you think you're more important than everyone else here?" "Your Honor," Kendra said, maintaining her composure, "I apologize for the delay. I was held up by an urgent human trafficking case that required immediate attention this morning. It's not out of disrespect for this court, but—" "There is no excuse for tardiness," Judge Whitman interrupted again, slamming his gavel. "This is not the place for federal prosecutors to grandstand about their workload. This court demands absolute respect, and I will not tolerate anyone disregarding its rules." The room seemed to hold its breath. Kendra stood still, working hard to suppress the frustration welling up inside her. She knew she hadn't disrespected the rules. She had done. Everything in her power to be on time, and her delay was justified. But his words painted a different picture. That she, a black woman, was irresponsible and arrogant. $750 fine for contempt of court, Judge Whitman declared, his tone icy. "You can pay it at the clerk's desk after the proceedings." Kendra felt her entire body stiffen. It wasn't just the fine, it was the public humiliation, the blatant message that she was not seen as equal in this space. She glanced around the room. The middle-aged man from earlier, the young woman, neither of them had faced any criticism, let alone a penalty for their tardiness. Kendra pressed her lips together and lifted her chin. "Your Honor," she said, her voice calm but resolute, "I do not intend to justify my lateness. However, I couldn't help but notice that other individuals who arrived late this morning were not penalized. I simply wish to ensure—" "Silence!" The gavel struck the bench forcefully again. "I will not tolerate anyone questioning the authority of this court. If you have concerns, file a formal complaint. For now, sit down." Kendra returned to her seat, feeling the weight of countless eyes on her. Some looked sympathetic, others curious. But deep inside, she knew this wasn't just stern discipline. This was bias. Judge Whitman's harshness wasn't coincidental. It was targeted at her, not because she was late, but because she was a black woman walking into this space as a figure of authority. She placed her briefcase on her lap, her hands clasping tightly together as her mind analyzed the situation. Every detail, every action by Judge Whitman stood out like figures on a spreadsheet she often worked with. This wasn't the first time he'd acted this way, and it certainly wouldn't be the last if no one stood up to him. Inside her, a new resolve began to take shape. This wasn't just about her property tax hearing anymore. It had become something much larger. Kendra clenched her hands tightly on her lap, trying to suppress the rising fury after Judge Whitman's ruling. The echo of the gavel striking the bench reverberated in her mind, a grim reminder that this injustice was not just personal, it was part of something much larger. She lifted her gaze, observing the proceedings in the courtroom. The subsequent cases were called with a mechanical regularity. A white man in a rumpled suit, someone she'd noticed entering later than she had, stood before the bench. He spoke with an easy, almost playful tone, discussing issues about a business license. Judge Whitman, who had been cold and severe with Kendra, simply nodded and ended the session with a mild warning. No gavel, no fines. Next, a young woman in casual attire approached. She had slipped into the room just minutes earlier, and the judge made a point of addressing the importance of punctuality. But, instead of a penalty, she received a sympathetic nod and a gentle admonishment in a nearly fatherly tone. "Be sure to come earlier next time, okay?" Kendra leaned back in her chair, her sharp eyes narrowing. The stark contrast in treatment wasn't something she was imagining. These weren't isolated judgments, they were. Symptoms of a biased system cloaked in the guise of justice. It was an injustice, hidden yet heavy, and she knew she had just stared it directly in the face. From across the room, the gaze of an older black man quietly met hers. He said nothing, but his eyes held an entire narrative, a story of decades enduring inequity. "We're used to this," his gaze seemed to say, filled with both bitterness and meaning. Kendra felt a weight settle in her chest. She wasn't just a federal prosecutor representing the law. In that moment, she realized she was standing there not just for her own rights, but for a community far too accustomed to silence. People like that older man, people who came here with no power or platform to make their voices heard, were the very reason she couldn't sit idly by. She turned her attention back to the documents in her hand, though her mind was no longer on the property tax dispute. Instead, she began taking detailed notes of everything she had just witnessed. Names of those who were let off, the times they arrived, and Judge Whitman's exact words. Every line she wrote was a piece of a larger story she knew she had to tell. Not just to defend herself, but to begin exposing the truth. Judge Whitman continued calling cases with a monotone voice, but every ruling he made further revealed the pattern Kendra was starting to see. White individuals, young and old, male and female, received sympathy or leniency. In contrast, even people of color who arrived on time but stumbled nervously through their defenses were dismissed with contempt. Kendra was no stranger to the legal system. She had witnessed countless trials, handled tough cases, and faced dangerous offenders. But what she felt here, in this old courtroom, was a cold, systematic injustice meticulously veiled under the pretense of discipline and courtroom decorum. The gavel struck again, pulling Kendra out of her thoughts. The older man had left the room, but his gaze lingered in her mind. She knew this wasn't the first time he had endured this, and if she didn't act, it wouldn't be the last. At that moment, Kendra made a decision. This morning would not end in silence. She wasn't here just to argue over her property taxes. She would use everything she had, her intellect, her experience, her position, to stand against the injustice she had witnessed. And above all, she would not back down. Kendra tightened her grip on the pen in her hand, her eyes fixed on the document before her. But the words had become a meaningless blur. In her mind, the images of silent, watchful eyes in the room, those of the elderly black man and the young woman recently acquitted, haunted her, a relentless reminder that silence only perpetuates injustice. She took a deep breath, lifted her head, and stepped back to the podium. The echo of her heels on the courtroom floor pierced the oppressive air. Judge Whitman glanced up, his expression sour. She immediately noticed the tightness in his jaw, a telltale sign of his displeasure. "Mr. Whitman," she began, her voice steady and resonant, "allow me to formally introduce myself. I am Kendra Johnson, federal prosecutor for the Northern District of South Carolina. I have served in this legal system for over a decade, handling cases ranging from human trafficking to corruption. And today, I stand here not merely to address a personal matter, but to defend a fundamental principle of the law: fairness." The room seemed to freeze. Judge Whitman struck his gavel forcefully, cutting her off. "Miss Johnson, I'm not interested in your titles or credentials. You are wasting the court's time with irrelevant statements." But Kendra pressed on. She stepped closer, her gaze sharp as a blade, locking onto his. "Your Honor," she said, her words deliberate, "I have one question. Does the law not apply equally to all?" The air in the room turned so silent one could hear the faint rustling of paper from the far corner. Some people looked up, their eyes a mixture of surprise and intrigue. Judge Whitman flinched slightly, but his expression quickly hardened. "Miss Johnson, I will not tolerate any challenge to my authority in this courtroom," he said, his tone colder than ever. "If you have a grievance, submit it through proper channels." Kendra stood her ground. "Then, Your Honor, let me make it clear to everyone here that justice must be impartial," she continued, her voice calm but unyielding. "I could not help but notice that those who preceded me this morning, a man and a young woman, faced no repercussions for their tardiness. Tell me, sir, can that be deemed fair?" The room collectively held its breath. The gazes of those present no longer avoided the issue but bore down on Judge Whitman. A few heads nodded subtly in agreement, while others quietly awaited his reaction. Judge Whitman leaned back in his chair, his icy blue eyes locked onto Kendra. "Miss Johnson," he said, his voice like tempered steel, "I'm under no obligation to explain how I conduct this courtroom. My rulings are final, and I advise you to tread carefully with your words." Kendra knew she was walking a fine line, but she also knew this was not the time to retreat. She met his stare, unwavering. "I respect the authority of this court," she said, "but I cannot respect a system where the most basic principles of law are not applied equally." Her words struck like an arrow through the tense atmosphere. In the back row, a few people nodded in silent agreement. The elderly man she had noticed earlier smiled faintly, his eyes glimmering with gratitude and hope. Judge Whitman exhaled sharply, struggling to maintain his composure. "This courtroom is not a platform for your grandstanding, Miss Johnson. You have said enough. I will not entertain further arguments. Sit down now, or I will consider this a continued contempt of court." Kendra paused for a moment, assessing the situation. She knew she couldn't push further, for now, but the resolve in her eyes made it clear that the matter was far from over. "Very well, Your Honor," she said, returning to her seat. "I trust we will have the opportunity to revisit what you deem unnecessary to explain." As she sat down, the room seemed to buzz with a newfound energy. Though no one dared to voice it, Kendra's words had undeniably shaken the facade of power Judge Whitman had constructed, and she knew this was just the beginning of a much larger battle, not just for herself, but for all those who had been crushed by injustice without a voice to fight back. As Kendra stepped out of the Greenville courthouse, she took a deep breath, the crisp morning air filling her lungs, yet doing little to calm the simmering frustration within her. The bustling noise of the streets outside was a stark contrast to the stifling tension she had just endured inside the courtroom. Sliding into her car, Kendra opened her briefcase and pulled out a notebook. Her pen began moving swiftly across the pages, capturing every detail she had witnessed during the hearing. Cases dismissed for tardiness, harsh words directed at her, and the unmistakable irritation on Judge Whitman's face when she dared to challenge him. His words, his demeanor, and his sharp glares were more than strictness. They were prejudice cloaked under the guise of judicial authority. She paused, her thoughts racing before continuing to write. This wasn't a one-off instance of bias. It was a symptom of a larger, deeply rooted injustice, a system that Judge Whitman epitomized. Those who faced harsher sentences were almost always people of color, like her. Meanwhile, others committing similar offenses often walked away with minimal consequences. Finishing her notes, she meticulously reviewed every detail before closing the notebook and slipping it back into her bag. Her phone buzzed, displaying the name Julia Harper, her supervisor at the federal prosecutor's office. "Kendra, what happened? I got word that your court session didn't go well." Julia's voice was a mix of concern and curiosity. "It didn't," Kendra replied, her tone steady. "But it's not just about the hearing. I believe I witnessed a small piece of a much bigger problem." She briefly recounted the events, emphasizing the blatant bias she had observed in Judge Whitman's handling of the cases. Julia listened silently, then finally said, "Send me everything you've got. If you're right, we can't let this slide." That evening, Kendra sat at her small apartment desk, the glow of her laptop screen reflecting her intense focus. Each word, each sentence she typed into her report carried weight. It wasn't just an account of that morning's events, but also a comprehensive breakdown of the systemic discrimination she had uncovered through old case files and testimonials from individuals who had experienced similar treatment in Judge Whitman's courtroom. As she delved deeper, one particular file caught her attention. Years ago, Judge Whitman had been accused of bias in a civil case where he imposed a penalty 3 times harsher on a black woman than on a white man in an almost identical situation. The case had been dismissed for lack of evidence, and the plaintiff had abandoned further pursuit, fearing repercussions. A slow, burning anger rose within Kendra. This wasn't the first time. Judge Whitman had a history, but he remained on the bench, free to wield his power unfairly. The silence of those before her had allowed him to continue unchecked. Kendra knew she was stepping into a daunting battle. The judicial system was a formidable institution, one that protected its own. But she wasn't deterred. Once her report was complete, she sent it to Julia and the investigative team at the federal prosecutor's office. Less than an hour later, Julia called back. "Kendra, I've gone through what you sent. If all of this checks out, this is a very serious issue. We're taking this to the Judicial Oversight Committee. They need to investigate immediately." Kendra felt a small wave of relief at Julia's support. Yet she also understood this was just the beginning. The fight ahead would be anything but easy, and figures like Judge Whitman wouldn't back down without resistance. The image of the older man she had seen in the courtroom that morning flashed in her mind. "We're used to this," his weary eyes seemed to say. But Kendra told herself, "No, this should never be accepted as normal." With that resolve, she knew she wouldn't stop, no matter what challenges lay ahead. The next morning, just as Kendra sipped her first cup of coffee, the phone rang. A colleague from the prosecutor's office was on the other end, voice brimming with excitement. "Kendra, have you seen it? Social media is exploding over your case." Frowning, Kendra unlocked her phone and was immediately swept into a torrent of notifications. A lengthy social media post, written by a law student who had been in the courtroom yesterday, was going viral with thousands of likes and shares. The post recounted in detail what had happened in the courtroom, Judge Whitman's harsh treatment of Kendra, the stark contrast in how he dealt with other defendants, and Kendra's sharp, unyielding questioning. The final line of the post hit like a hammer. "This is not just a story about injustice towards a black woman. This is a story about a system that needs to change." Beneath the post, comments poured in. Some shared similar experiences in Judge Whitman's courtroom. One woman wrote, "I was fined $500 just for accidentally putting the wrong date on a permit application. But when a white man made the same mistake right after me, he only got a gentle reminder." Soon after, hashtags like #Justice for All and #Equal Justice began trending, spreading rapidly. Posts, videos, and images related to Kendra's case flooded social media. Hundreds of people reshared the story, expressing support and calling for a thorough investigation into Judge Whitman's conduct. At the prosecutor's office, Kendra sat in front of her computer, watching the story spread like wildfire. Though the public attention was slightly unnerving, she understood that this could be the breakthrough the system desperately needed. The media didn't waste time jumping on the story. Local newspapers began running headlines like "Federal Prosecutor Challenges Injustice in the Judicial System" and "Bias in the Courtroom, Judge Under Fire for Discrimination." Sensational headlines filled the airwaves. "Unequal Justice, Greenville Judge Faces Allegations of Discrimination," and "Breaking the Silence on a Flawed Justice System." Kendra could feel the mounting pressure building against Judge Whitman. She knew that the combination of media scrutiny and public outrage could become the most powerful weapon to force accountability. Not just for him, but for the broader system he represented. Meanwhile, in his chambers, Judge Whitman held the morning paper with trembling hands. The front page headline pierced his pride. "Biased Justice. Is Fairness Just an Illusion?" The subheadline listed specific cases where he was accused of favoritism over the years. Whitman set the newspaper down, tension surging through him like a rising tide. He had always been accustomed to control, to the fear and silence of those who appeared before him. But now, Kendra's case was like a crack in the fortress of his authority, spreading rapidly. He grabbed his phone and barked at his assistant, "Find out who leaked this, and get my lawyer on the line, now." At the same time, Kendra's story ignited a spark in the Greenville community. Groups advocating for equal justice began organizing meetings, holding small protests outside the courthouse, and demanding systemic reform. Signs bearing phrases like "Justice for All" and "Enough is enough" appeared throughout the city. An elderly woman in one of the protests shared with a reporter, "I've lived here for 50 years, and I never thought I'd see someone brave enough to stand up like she did. She's given us hope that things can change." Kendra, though she avoided excessive media attention, couldn't ignore the groundswell of support. One afternoon, she received an email from a woman in another city who had faced similar unfair treatment in a courtroom. The email read, "Thank you for not staying silent. You've spoken for so many of us who were too scared to speak up." Holding her phone, Kendra stared at the screen, the weight of responsibility pressing heavily on her shoulders. She realized she had sparked something much larger than herself, and there was no turning back now. To herself, she whispered, "If we let this slide, nothing will ever change. This is just the beginning." Kendra sat in her office, the dim light from her computer screen casting a soft glow on her face. She was reviewing a stream of emails and reports recently received from colleagues and supporters. The constant flow of information painted an increasingly detailed picture of what was happening in Judge Whitman's courtroom. The official investigation had begun, and the pieces of the puzzle were starting to emerge. One of the first critical sources came from Mrs. Evelyn Thompson, the longtime clerk of the Greenville court. Evelyn had witnessed hundreds of trials presided over by Judge Whitman. Initially hesitant to speak when approached by investigators, Evelyn agreed to come forward after assurances that her identity would be protected. In a confidential interview at a small office far from the courthouse, Evelyn nervously opened her old silver handbag. Inside was a small leather-bound notebook, its cover worn from years of use. Her hands trembled as she placed the notebook on the table. "I've kept this for many years," Evelyn said, her voice quivering yet resolute. "I didn't know if I should say anything, but I can't stay silent any longer." The notebook's pages were filled with dense handwritten notes, documenting each trial where Evelyn felt something was amiss. Names of defendants, fines, and occasionally even specific remarks by Judge Whitman were meticulously recorded. Her notes painted a clear picture. Black defendants were consistently given harsher penalties, denied leniency, and sometimes even publicly humiliated by the judge. There was one time when a black man came in over a minor rent dispute, Evelyn recalled, her eyes reddening as the memory surfaced. Judge Whitman fined him $1,000 and said, "Maybe you should learn to take responsibility instead of making excuses." But just a few weeks later, a white man in a similar situation was let off with a warning because of his difficult circumstances. Evelyn paused, tears streaming down her face. "I always thought no one would listen, but now things are different." Evelyn's account was just one of many pieces of evidence coming to light. James Wilson, a court security officer who had worked there for 15 years, also decided to speak out. "I've seen this happen my entire career," James said in an interview with the investigative team. "Whitman was always tougher on black people. Sometimes I wondered if it was intentional or if he just thought no one would question it." James recounted a recent case where a young black woman was fined $500 for a parking violation. She tried to explain her situation, but he cut her off immediately, James said, his voice tinged with sadness. Meanwhile, just a few hours later, a white man asked for a warning and got it, without needing to explain anything. Testimonies and evidence like this began to form a comprehensive picture of Judge Whitman's behavior. The investigative team from the Judicial Oversight Committee quickly gathered additional records from previous years, and the findings did not surprise Kendra. Statistical data revealed that the average penalties Judge Whitman imposed on black defendants were 3 times higher than those for white defendants for the same offenses. But it wasn't just about the numbers. Personal stories began to emerge, shining a light on the injustice many had silently endured. One young woman shared how she had to sell her car to pay off a fine from Whitman, while her white friend only received a warning for the same infraction. A former attorney in Greenville even admitted that he had advised many of his black clients to avoid going to court, knowing they wouldn't be treated fairly. Public pressure continued to mount. Articles in local and national media began calling Whitman a symbol of a broken judicial system. Larger protests were organized outside the Greenville courthouse, with human rights groups and community members rallying together. Kendra monitored everything, watching as each step revealed more of the truth. Every testimony and new piece of evidence was another brick in the collapsing wall of deception Judge Whitman had built. But she also knew this battle was far from over. People like Whitman didn't admit wrongdoing easily, and the system he represented wasn't something that could be changed overnight. Standing in front of the mirror in her apartment, Kendra gazed at her reflection. Her eyes burned with determination. This fight wasn't just for her, it was for Evelyn, James, and countless others who had endured injustice and dared to hope that justice would finally prevail. In the closed meeting room of the Judicial Oversight Committee, the atmosphere was so heavy that every breath felt palpable. Kendra sat upright at the presentation table, facing a large screen displaying graphs and documents her team had painstakingly gathered over the past several weeks. Surrounding her were committee members, ranging from senior judges to legal investigators, all listening intently. What you're about to see is not just a series of isolated incidents, Kendra began, her voice calm yet powerful. It is a comprehensive picture of how one individual, through their authority, has distorted a justice system meant to uphold fairness. The screen switched to a statistical chart. Kendra continued, "Data collected over the past 5 years shows that the average penalties for black defendants in Greenville's courts are 3 times higher than those for white defendants, despite the nature of the violations being similar." She pressed a button, and a series of case files appeared. "Take a look at these cases," she said, pointing to the screen. A black woman fined $500 for a parking violation. A white man, for the same infraction, let off with a warning. A black woman denied a sentence reduction despite proving financial hardship, while a white defendant with the same argument received empathy from Judge Whitman. The room fell silent. One committee member, an older man with gold-rimmed glasses, leaned forward, his brows furrowed. "Has this data been verified?" he asked sternly. Kendra nodded. "All this data was extracted from Greenville Court's public records and meticulously cross-verified by my legal team. Additionally, we have testimonies from witnesses, including court clerks and security staff." She pressed on. "These actions are not random. They reflect a systematic pattern of bias perpetuated by Judge Marcus Whitman's authority, cloaked under the guise of discipline and law enforcement." The pressure mounted as the Oversight Committee's investigators began publicly expanding their inquiry. Witness interviews were conducted in rapid succession. Not only did Evelyn Thompson and James Wilson come forward, but former staff members from Greenville's court also began to speak out. A former attorney in Greenville shared, "We always knew that appearing before Judge Whitman meant black clients would never get a fair chance. I advised them to accept plea deals, not because they were guilty, but because I knew they wouldn't be treated justly." An administrative employee recounted an unforgettable incident. One time, a black woman broke down in tears in the courtroom after being fined $200 for a minor dispute. She pleaded for an explanation, but Whitman just smirked and said, "The law doesn't care about your tears." These accounts quickly spread beyond the confines of the investigation. Both local and national media covered the story extensively, increasing the pressure on Greenville's court system. Human rights activists organized public gatherings where people shared stories of the injustices they had faced. Kendra worked tirelessly. She realized that while the evidence against Whitman was damning, the problem extended beyond a single individual. The system itself had allowed such behavior to persist and thrive. Gaps in oversight, employees' fear of retribution, and a lack of transparency had turned justice into a privilege for the powerful. At a press conference outside Greenville's courthouse, a spokesperson for the Oversight Committee declared, "We are expanding this investigation, not only into Judge Marcus Whitman's conduct, but also into the operational practices of Greenville's judicial system. Justice is not just the outcome of rulings, it's in how we administer it." Standing at a distance, Kendra observed the crowd of reporters and community members. Though she stayed away from the spotlight, she knew that every move she made was being closely watched. That night, seated at her desk, she wrote a new report addressed to Julia Harper, her direct supervisor at the prosecutor's office. In the report, she emphasized, "We are not merely dealing with a biased judge. This is a crisis of faith in our legal system. Without decisive action, we risk losing not only justice, but also the public's trust in it." With every report submitted and every story shared, Kendra knew she was contributing to building a better system. But she also understood that the pressure was just beginning and that this fight was far from over. The morning after the announcement of an expanded investigation, the Greenville courthouse was more bustling than ever. Residents from across the city and neighboring areas gathered outside, holding signs with phrases like "Justice knows no color" and "End bias now." The chants demanding reform and fairness echoed in the air, each beat amplifying the mounting pressure on the local judicial system. Kendra stepped out of her car, observing the scene from a distance. Dozens of people, human rights activists, young attorneys, and ordinary citizens, were marching peacefully. Many familiar faces were among them, individuals who had once been victims of injustice, but now stood resolute, refusing to remain silent any longer. In the crowd, an elderly woman with a slender figure and a face etched with wrinkles held a handwritten sign tightly. When approached by a reporter, she gave a bittersweet smile and said, "At last, someone dares to speak the truth." Her voice trembled but carried unwavering determination. "We've endured this for far too long. Kendra Johnson has given us hope that things can change." Her words quickly became a symbol for the movement. Journalists captured her image, standing in the crowd, holding a sign with the simple but powerful words, "Justice for all." Meanwhile, articles from both local and national outlets relentlessly analyzed Kendra's story and its impact on the justice system. A front-page article in the Greenville Post bore the headline, "Kendra Johnson, a symbol of justice." The piece detailed her journey, from facing discrimination in the courtroom to spearheading a movement for legal fairness. One excerpt read, "Kendra Johnson has not only stood against the injustice she personally endured, but has become a voice for an entire community long ignored. Her fight isn't just for herself, it's for everyone who has ever been betrayed by the justice system." At the heart of the movement, other stories of injustice continued to surface, adding to the mounting evidence of Judge Whitman's bias. A middle-aged man, fined over $2,000 for a minor construction dispute, shared his story with the media. "I thought no one would believe me, that I was just a lone victim. But now, I know I'm not alone." A young lawyer recounted her experiences representing clients of color in Judge Whitman's courtroom. "Every time I walked into that courtroom, I knew they'd face harsher penalties, tougher judgments, and I couldn't do anything about it. Now, thanks to Kendra, we have a chance to change that." The pressure intensified as major human rights organizations, including national-level groups, began to turn their attention to Greenville. A team of lawyers from the American Civil Rights Legal Foundation announced their support for the investigation and pledged to propose reforms for South Carolina's judicial system. Meanwhile, local community groups didn't stop at demonstrations. They organized meetings to share stories, support those facing legal issues, and plan long-term initiatives to ensure bias would no longer prevail. Though avoiding direct media attention, Kendra received an outpouring of messages and emails from people she had never met. One came from a young woman in another city who had faced a similar situation. "Kendra, your story gave me the courage to speak out about things I've kept bottled up for too long. Thank you for not staying silent." Kendra knew she was standing at the center of a wave of change. The movement she hadn't meant to ignite had grown into a wildfire, demanding reform not only in Greenville but across the state's entire justice system. Yet she also understood that any real change required persistence, and this fight was only just beginning. As night fell, the glow of signs and phone lights still flickered outside the Greenville courthouse. Standing by her apartment window, Kendra gazed at the lights, drawing strength from the community's unity. She whispered to herself, "I'm not alone, and this time, neither are they." The brilliant morning light at the Greenville courthouse couldn't dissipate the thick tension hanging in the air. A crowd, larger than on any previous day, had gathered outside. Banners waved high, and chants echoed continuously, "Justice for all," and "Whitman must be held accountable." From a small office on the courthouse's top floor, Judge Marcus Whitman stared down at the crowd through the glass pane. His eyes betrayed exhaustion, his clenched jaw a clear sign of the weight he was trying to bear. On his desk lay that morning's newspaper, its bold headline screaming, "Judge Whitman faces allegations of systemic discrimination." Below the headline was his photograph, accompanied by damning statistics and accounts brought to light by the investigation. Whitman's downfall began with irrefutable evidence. Data uncovered by the Judicial Oversight Commission illuminated a stark pattern of behavior. Charts showing disproportionately harsh sentences imposed on black defendants compared to white ones weren't just numbers. They were a stronger indictment than any spoken argument could ever be. Coupled with testimonies from court staff like Evelyn Thompson and James Wilson, as well as community stories, the portrait of Whitman's abuse of power became undeniable. Pressure from the media, the public, and even his colleagues within the judiciary intensified. "You can't stay in this position any longer," a fellow judge told him bluntly during a private meeting. "This isn't just about your reputation. It's about undermining the public's trust in the system we represent." Whitman's resignation was announced not long afterward. A brief press release from the Greenville courthouse stated that Judge Whitman would be stepping down in the interest of the judicial system and the Greenville community. But the public wasn't satisfied with such vague words. They demanded acknowledgement. And so, in a tense press conference, Whitman made his final appearance as a judge. Standing behind the podium under the glare of cameras, Whitman began to speak, though his voice lacked the confidence and authority it once held. "I acknowledge that, over the years, I have failed to maintain the fairness I should have upheld," he said, his eyes fixed on the paper in his hands. "My decisions may have caused a sense of injustice, and I deeply regret if that was the case." But his apology convinced no one. The language he used, vague and noncommittal, only fueled the dissatisfaction. "A sense of injustice?" A protester outside the courthouse scoffed. "It's not a feeling, it's a fact." The climax came as Whitman exited the press conference, His vacant stare and slumped shoulders, as though carrying the weight of the world, marked a turning point in Kendra's journey. He stepped out of the courthouse's main doors, facing hundreds of watchful eyes. The crowd neither shouted nor attacked. They simply stood, silent but resolute, their presence a verdict louder than words. A woman, holding a sign that read, "Justice without bias," stepped forward, locking eyes with Whitman in fearless defiance. He lowered his head, hurried through the crowd, and disappeared behind the door of a waiting car. From her office window, Kendra watched the scene unfold. It wasn't a complete victory, but it was a beginning. The image of Whitman, a man who once embodied absolute power, now forced to reckon with his actions, served as a powerful reminder that justice, though delayed, could still prevail. "This fight isn't over," she told herself, "but this is a significant step." In that moment, she felt the unity of the community below. Together, they had broken the silence, and the judicial system could no longer ignore them. Turning back to her desk, Kendra began preparing for the next steps. The road ahead would be long, but she was ready to lead the charge. The early morning sunlight streamed through the pristine glass windows of the Greenville Courthouse, a building that once symbolized injustice, but now began to embody the promise of a new chapter. Kendra walked slowly down the newly renovated hallway. Everything seemed brighter, yet the atmosphere retained its solemn dignity. She stopped in front of a new bronze plaque mounted next to the main entrance. The engraved words stood out boldly against the polished surface. "Equal justice is the right of all." Kendra stood still for a moment, overwhelmed by a surge of emotion. It wasn't just a slogan, it was a commitment, a testament to the struggles the community had endured to achieve this milestone. Her eyes stung as memories of the early days of their fight flooded back, days when change had seemed impossible. After Judge Whitman's resignation, Greenville Courthouse quickly implemented a series of reforms, not only to restore public trust, but also to ensure that similar injustices would never happen again. Mandatory, implicit bias training was introduced for all judges and courthouse staff. For the first time, open forums were held where judges, attorneys, and even defendants could discuss how biases might influence legal decisions. "No one wants to admit they're biased," one training facilitator said during the inaugural session. "But the truth is, we all are. The first step toward justice is recognizing and managing those biases." A fairness monitoring system was also implemented across the Greenville judicial system. An independent council was formed to review judges' decisions, compare sentencing across racial and demographic groups, and identify cases with significant discrepancies. At one of the council's meetings, Kendra participated as an advisor. Beside her were lawyers and experts from across the state, all committed to building a more transparent judicial system. "What happens here doesn't just affect Greenville," Kendra said, her voice steady yet resolute. "It sends a message that we will not tolerate injustice anywhere. If one system can change, then every system can change." The reforms were not without resistance. Some longtime judges and attorneys felt threatened by the heightened scrutiny and new requirements. A few complained that the training programs were unnecessary and political. "I've worked here for 30 years without anyone needing to teach me how to be a judge," one judge remarked during a private meeting. But the silence from his colleagues in response spoke volumes. No one wanted to publicly defend the outdated practices that had been so thoroughly discredited. Kendra refused to let the negativity deter her. She traveled across the state, attending discussions and training sessions at other courthouses. At each stop, she listened to stories, shared her experiences, and inspired others to believe that true justice was possible. During a training session in Columbia, a young judge approached her afterward. "Your story has changed how I view my work," he said. "I used to think that simply applying the law was enough. But now I understand that justice requires fairness, empathy, and a deeper perspective." Kendra smiled. This was why she kept fighting. One morning, she returned to the Greenville courthouse for a small event. The once drab hallways were now adorned with murals depicting the city's history, along with informational displays about defendants' rights and legal aid services. A group of elementary school students was touring the courthouse. As Kendra passed by, a teacher pointed to the new plaque outside and explained to the children, "This is a reminder that everyone has the right to be treated fairly, no matter who they are." Kendra smiled, but inside she felt the weight of those words. They weren't just for the children. They were for everyone. For those who had felt unheard, for those who had believed the system wasn't meant for them. Looking back at the plaque once more, she reminded herself, "We've come a long way, but this journey is far from over." The familiar corridors of the Greenville courthouse now linger only as a fragment of Kendra's memory. Every time she revisits the place, she feels the palpable changes: the glow from freshly painted walls, the buzz of legal aid programs, and, most strikingly, the atmosphere of a community rekindling its faith in justice. But today, Kendra's journey has transcended the boundaries of Greenville. She is no longer just a federal prosecutor or a champion of justice in a small town. Her name has become synonymous with a sweeping judicial reform movement across the United States. Law schools, legal workshops, and community forums nationwide invite Kendra to speak, share her experiences, and inspire the younger generation. At a lecture at Harvard Law School, Kendra stood before an auditorium packed with students. Each young face was locked onto her, absorbing every word she uttered. "Justice is not an abstract concept," she began, her warm, resonant voice filling the room. "It doesn't just live in statutes or textbooks. Justice is how we treat one another, how we listen, and how we ensure that everyone is treated fairly, no matter who they are." A student stood up and asked, "Ms. Johnson, what kept you from giving up, even when things seemed too hard?" Kendra paused, her gaze turning reflective. "I couldn't give up because I wasn't just fighting for myself. I was fighting for those without a voice, for people who had endured injustice for far too long, and I knew that if I stopped, change would never come." The movement Kendra spearheaded didn't stop in South Carolina. Similar investigations began to surface in other states, from Alabama to Ohio, as local communities realized their right to demand a more transparent and equitable justice system. States started implementing independent judicial oversight programs, incorporating bias training into standard procedures, and establishing judicial councils to ensure fairness in legal decisions. One of the most compelling stories unfolded in a small Texas town, where a judge was discovered to exhibit biases similar to Whitman's. Thanks to community pressure and support from organizations Kendra advised, the judge was removed, paving the way for significant local reforms. 3 years after Kendra first walked into the Greenville courtroom as a defendant, she returned to the city to attend the inauguration of the Kendra Johnson Center for Judicial Ethics. This center would stand as a beacon of fairness, integrity, and respect within the legal system. Stepping onto the stage, Kendra looked out at a crowd filled with both familiar and new faces. In the front row sat Evelyn Thompson, James Wilson, and many others who had stood by her side throughout this journey, their eyes glowing with pride. Kendra took a deep breath and spoke. Justice isn't just about the law. Justice is how we treat one another. It's how we ensure no one is left behind, that everyone has a voice and is heard. Justice isn't merely something we wish for. It's a responsibility each of us must carry. As she paused, applause erupted, filling the room. Looking at the radiant faces before her, Kendra felt a profound belief in the future. Her work was far from finished, but she knew that each step, each action, was building a better world. In the glow of the ceremony, the inscription on the newly placed bronze plaque at the center shimmered. Justice is not a destination, but a journey. Kendra Johnson's story is not just the journey of one individual. It's a reminder that any of us can become agents of change. Justice isn't always easy to achieve, but with determination, solidarity, and the courage to stand up, we can make the system fairer for everyone. So, what do you think we can do to ensure justice is always served fairly? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear from you. If this story inspired you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel so we can continue bringing you meaningful stories like this. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next video.